Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into our second research lab series that has been hosted here at the Institute for Social and Cultural Research. As we commence our second research lab series, I would like to thank you all once again for joining us. Thank you for those that are joining us here on Zoom and those that are joining us via YouTube. So thank you all once again for being with us this morning. As I had mentioned, this is our second lab series. We had our first lab series commence with Dr. Andok Eo, and he had done his wonderful presentation for us. And now we are going to be joined by Dr. Rajeshwari Dutt, and she's a historian. Her topic is on emancipation and imperialism in a borderland, the challenge to settler sovereignty over slavery in Belize during the 1820s. Before we commence with Dr. Dutt's presentation, I would also like to request Mr. Rolando Cocom, the Director of the Institute for Social and Cultural Research, for some welcome remarks. Good morning, Director Cocom.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our audience currently on the Zoom and those who will be joining us on the recording. We are so excited to be able to do this series and also to count on our collaborators who make this event possible. I especially think about our institutional partners, the good folks at the Ministry of Education, Culture, Science and Technology, the Belize Archives and Record Service, the Belize National Library Service and Information System, and the University of Belize, where several of our attendees are from, including lecturers and students, especially those at the Faculty of Education and Arts in the history program. Very grateful that you all are able to join us this morning. The Institute for Social and Cultural Research is tasked with a heavy responsibility of increasing the capacity of Belizeans to conduct research, to catalog research in the various fields of history, anthropology, and other social sciences, including linguistics and economics. We are very pleased to be able to manage a network of researchers, including our international researchers and our local researchers, to be able to cultivate lectures, conferences, reports that helps to inspire upcoming research, that helps to inspire policy changes for the improvement of Belize. The idea of a lab is to stimulate discussion, to stimulate the experimentation of ideas, to test our hypotheses as they emerge through research. And one of the things we've been focusing on is to have some of the research that of national interest and are more timely at this juncture of our calendar. And so we have been prioritizing in the previous session and the upcoming sessions, trying to reinterpret our African and Maya heritage. And so Dr. Eo was able to kickstart that for us. And now we have a good colleague and friend of ISCR, Dr. Rajeshwari Dutt, who we have not had the pleasure to really meet in person, but she did meet with some of our colleagues here at ISCR, including Mr. Giovanni Pinello, who leads our public history research, and he's on this session today. So we're very glad that we are able to ensure that we have continuity. And the second point is to say that Dr. Rajeshwari has been doing just some excellent research. She writes very coherently and concisely, giving us just sufficient context as well, sufficient details that she's been able to glean from the archives And maybe after our presentation, we can learn a bit more, just like the practical tips around these methodological aspects of doing research from India. And so we're very excited about that. But a little bit more about Dr. Rajeshwari, if I may. Dr. Rajeshwari Dutt is an associate professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi of India. Her research focuses on 19th century Latin America and British imperial history. She is the author of 2 academic books, Maya Caciques in Early National Yucatan, published by Oklahoma University, 2017, and Empire on Edge, the British struggle for order in Belize during Yucatan's Coast War, 1847 to 1901, published by Cambridge University, 2020. Now, that book has not been well known among us, I would say, in Belize, and especially among our students, and that's the reason why we have Dr. Raj with us. And she won't be speaking about that topic, but it gets us intrigued about what that book was about, especially since it was published in the year of the pandemic. So very few of us were reading academic texts for the past 2 years. But things have now settled down, and so classes have resumed in person at the University of Belize. So I expect more students to become familiar with your work, Dr. Rajan. I'm sure they will probably try to schedule other appearances for you at the University of Belize to discuss that work, and we would certainly support it. Dr. Raj is currently working on a monograph on the failed quest for the Nicaragua Canal in the 19th century, and I'm sure she's working on other items which we are hopefully get to learn about in the Q&A session. Dr. Raj, just for our audience, let me repeat the format for today's session. You will make a very short presentation, about 20 minutes or so, and then we will follow with a discussion, you and I, just picking up on some of the highlights of the presentation for about maybe 10 minutes. And then we proceed into a Q&A with our attendees. Attendees, please feel free to use the raise your hand feature or put your questions in the comment, and April will do her best to moderate and try as much as possible to get different questions on the table for us. So thank you so much, Dr. Rajeshwari. I believe it's nighttime where you're at, so thank you so much for your sacrifice and your support in this endeavor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rolando, and thank you everyone for joining in today. Actually, NICH and ISCR have been really instrumental in my own work. So since I started working on Belize in 2014, I have actually had a lot of help from first Giovanni and then Rolando in the kind of work that I do. And of course, for me, it's really important because I'm based in India. So, it's just been, he's Rolando and the NICH and ISCR have really bridged that distance for me in terms of doing my own research. So I'm really grateful to ISCR for that. I'm also really excited to present my work today, and I'm going to be sort of looking for your suggestions as well as I take this project forward. I'm going to try to keep this quite informal and try to talk to perhaps also later on about kind of methods and things. Roland, I'm going to try to share screen, but somehow my internet when I'm sharing screen is kind of, not being very stable. So let me know if it goes away, then maybe I will just talk without sharing screen.
Duly noted, Dr. Raj. We will let you know.
Thank you. Okay, so let me go back. All right. So so this is actually my work on slavery in Belize, and my first real attempt at looking at slavery in Belize. It's something that I want to keep working on, but this was my very first attempt at kind of making sense of it. So what I try to do basically in this paper is I look at the 1820s as a kind of singular moment in Belizean history. And I do it by looking at how the 1820s was a moment in which there was an unprecedented challenge to white settler sovereignty over slavery. and how it was from both from the top and from the bottom. So it was not just one way, but in kind of challenges from both the top and the bottom, and leading to a kind of fracturing of what had till then been a kind of unbridled power or sovereignty over the institution of slavery and enslaved people as persons in the settlement of Belize. But what I also do, and it was interesting for me as I was doing my research, it was also interesting how white settlers actually responded to this kind of challenge that they faced, and that they responded by crafting a narrative of benign slavery. And this was one of the kind of origin myths of Belize. And so it was a very crucial moment to see how this was one point in which that origin myth began to evolve. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. Rolando, I'm still on, and no freezing or anything, right?
So far, so good. Thank you.
So far, so good. Okay, we'll keep our fingers crossed. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and try to present this. All right. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about Belize and the Mosquito Coast. So Mosquito Coast is the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. And it has a very long history of association with Belize, going back to the very beginnings of Belize. And so and in fact, it's quite interesting to see how people, goods, ideas circulated in this kind of triangle between Jamaica, Belize, and the Mosquito Shore. Now, for the purpose of this presentation and this paper, the importance of Mosquito Shore also is because there is an evacuation of the Mosquito Shore in the late 18th century. And a lot of white settlers, British settlers who had lived in Mosquito Shore before that, actually go and settle in Belize, and they bring with them their enslaved persons, and they come and they settle in Belize. Now, this, of course, alters the demography of Belize and is also an important kind of information to know to kind of place what happens in the 1820s in context. Now, it's interesting to note that also that in the early 19th century, Belize was very tenuously connected with the British Empire. So Belize, for instance, the Parliamentary Act of 1817 defined Belize as a settlement for certain purposes in the possession and under the protection of His Majesty, but not within the territory and dominion of His Majesty. Now, you can actually see that this was a really vague definition, and this actually had some compounding consequences. One of the consequences was that because it was so vaguely defined, that it was not possible to see to what extent British imperial law should be applicable in the settlement. It also meant that West Indian laws were not enacted in the settlement. And this had important consequences because it meant that there were virtually no imperial laws or West Indian laws governing slavery that were applied in Belize. This created a situation where you had the white settlers, also who call themselves the Baymen, who exercise almost unbridled sovereignty over both the institution of slavery and also over enslaved people as persons. And this was a very important sort of background to what I'm going to talk about. Now, one of the important things to think about when we think about emancipation is that emancipation, when in terms of as a result of kind of both movements from above and below, and also British abolitionism as it developed over time. Now, abolitionism developed in phases. And so in the 1820s was a phase in which amelioration took center stage. Now, amelioration is basically improvement. And what happened in the 1820s is that both pro-slavery advocates, which included planters and other sort of owners of enslaved persons or plantations, and anti-slavery advocates, both converged on amelioration as the way forward. Now, there was a reason for this. Pro-slavery advocates thought that if they just improved the condition of enslaved people, then they didn't have to go towards full emancipation. So they could basically stall full emancipation by just improving the condition a bit. And that's why they wanted amelioration. And the anti-slavery group thought that amelioration was going to be a prelude to full emancipation. And so they thought this would be a gradual way of getting towards full emancipation. So in the 1820s, you have this really interesting moment when pro-slavery, anti-slavery all converge on amelioration. And why it's interesting in the case of Belize is that both the British imperial government in the form of the superintendent and also the white settlers also converge on amelioration. They all justify their actions using this idea of amelioration. Amelioration is also important because it was the first time that the British Empire was trying to get a full cognizance of the ways in which slavery was operating in the colonies. And they were going to try to tie the empire into one legal framework. So there was a lot of attempts in terms of trying to get not just Belize, but a lot of other Caribbean colonies also in much more regulated within a British Empire. Right, so that is why this moment is kind of important. And this kind of moment is what contextualizes for us what happens in the 1820s. So the first moment I'm going to talk about is the case of the enslaved Indians from Mosquito Shore. And this happens in 1822. And the kind of background to this is that, as we talked about, Belize did not have any kind of legal regime that had any imperial purview on it. This meant that the white settlers or the Baymen had a lot of power. And one of the things they did was to have the public meeting, which elected magistrates. The magistrates in most cases were also owners of enslaved people. And so they had their own interests in mind. And they had a lot of power. Now, the only challenge to the magistrate's power was really the superintendent, who was basically the eyes and ears of the imperial government on the ground. Now, George Arthur, his tenure as a superintendent, I feel, is kind of a turning point, because during George Arthur's superintendency, you actually see this kind of, collision between the settlers and the imperial government really come into action. And so it's important to talk a little bit about George Arthur as well. So when he first comes into the settlement, George Arthur actually believes that the slavery in Belize is benign. This is something he actually does believe. They don't use the word benign at that point, but he believes that there is something good about it. But then he actually witnesses several cases of corporal punishment meted out to female enslaved people. And in each of these cases, he realizes that there is something very wrong happening here. But at the same time, when he tries to bring those cases to the courts of the settlement, nothing comes out of them. And then he realizes that the courts of the settlement are unable to provide justice to enslaved people. And when he realizes this, he actually decides to institute the Consolidated Slave Law of Jamaica in Belize. Now, so this is the background of George Arthur as someone who tries to bring Belize within imperial legal purview, within the legal jurisdiction of the empire. Now, the case of the enslaved indigenous from Mosquito Shore actually starts when in 1821, one of the owners of a group of enslaved indigenous who had evacuated from Mosquito Shore in the 18th century. So in 1821, this person, the owner, dies. And then there is a question of how to dispose of the enslaved people that he has under his control. And because Arthur has instituted this consolidated slave law of Jamaica, a lot of not just these enslaved people who were whose owner had died, but also a lot of other indigenous, enslaved people claiming indigenous origin started petitioning and asking for their freedom on the grounds that they had illegally been held in slavery. Now, when they do this petition, George Arthur is really keen that they get some justice, but he realizes early on, because he has experience of this from when he saw the corporal punishment on female enslaved people and couldn't do anything about it. So now he decides that he's actually not going to send this case to the courts of the settlement. He's going to create a completely new body and give them the task of investigating this case. So he creates something called the Board of Commission. And the Board of Commission is composed of 3 members, and they are tasked with investigating the case. And so every morning at 11 o'clock, they sit, they bring in the witnesses, they talk to the, enslaved people still couldn't give any kind of representations or, kind of their own side in the court, but they had witnesses who came in who corroborated for some of them that, yes, they had indigenous descent. And after some time, after the Board of Commission had interviewed all the witnesses and others, they came to the conclusion that these enslaved people should be given their freedom. Now, when George Arthur actually brings that resolution to the magistrates of the settlement, there is a lot of backlash. So the magistrates refuse to entertain this idea that these indigenous enslaved people should be given their freedom. And so then George Arthur is in a, and of course also what is also happening is that as this case is taking shape, there is a lot of friction happening between enslaved people and their owners. And the white settlers. And the friction is that the indigenous enslaved people stop showing up. There's a lot of absenteeism, refusal to work, and the white settlers kind of retaliate by being violent towards those indigenous enslaved people. When George Arthur realizes this, that there's actually this huge turmoil in the settlement, he does something really, really unprecedented. He tells the Board of Commission, which is a separate body from the public meeting or the magistrates, he tells the Board of Commission to take all of these enslaved indigenous people under their protection. Now, this is a very, very unprecedented thing, because for the first time, George Arthur is really bypassing all the mechanisms of law in Belize. Neither does he go to the courts of the settlement, he bypasses them, he bypasses the magistrates, and he goes straight and he says, okay, you have to protect these enslaved people. And then this again creates, the situation keeps going from bad to worse, because the white settlers try to dig up evidence to show that, these enslaved people are really not indigenous. So the years of kind of, mixture and meant that most of the petitioners were Afro-indigenous. And what the settlers would say is that these are actually not indigenous at all. They are just, trying to use that to get their freedom. So this was going on. So in the end, what George Arthur does, which is very interesting, is that he realizes that he has to take this to London. He actually has to take this to the metropolitan government. And so he sends this whole case to the Secretary of State for War and Colonies, which is Earl Bathurst. And he gives him the case and says, okay, now you take a decision. Now, it's interesting, in the 1820s, there were all these commissions of legal inquiry that the British imperial government used to send out to the colonies on fact-finding missions. So they were mostly London-trained barristers who were sent on these inquiries, and they were sent all across the Caribbean to gather information on the legal systems and then suggest, as needed, amendments to those systems. And so what Earl Bathurst does is that he sends a commission of legal inquiry to Belize. And this body, which is a metropolitan body, comes in and looks at the case, investigates it, and then gives his verdict, which is that all petitioners, regardless of their ethnic origin, should be emancipated. And it's through that, and although the white settlers try their best, they go to Jamaica, they make representations there, they ultimately fail to stop this. And about 3 years before, the formal emancipation, the Mosquito Shore enslaved persons get their freedom, right? So this is the first kind of moment of the 1820s that I wanted to look at, which exemplified this, this fracturing of settler sovereignty over slavery. Not only had their, there's all their institutions been bypassed, but the metropolitan government had clearly made its voice heard in terms of what should and should not happen in the settlement. So this is the first moment. The second moment is actually in 1825. Now, to give a little bit of kind of context to that, I put this map here on the abolition of slavery in the Americas. And one of the things you'll notice when you look at this map is how different the timeline is of emancipation in different places around the Americas. And this is something I think it's kind of interesting, even for, I think, others of you who are looking at future kind of research topics and things. It's really interesting what happens when there are these layers of freedom and unfreedom coexisting at the same time. What happens in the case of Belize is that in 1825, there's a lot of migration of enslaved people to Guatemala, mostly as runaways. And when this happens, at this point, the superintendent is Edward Codd, and he's much more sympathetic to planter interests. And he actually blames the Mosquito Shore case on this flight, saying that it set a very bad example, and that's why enslaved people were leaving and going to Guatemala. What was really happening, though, is that the Central America had already, had its emancipation in 1824. So Guatemala was a free place, and therefore you had people in a lot of huge numbers trying to leave Belize, which was still an unfree place, and going towards Guatemala. It's important to note that this was not the first time that there had been enslaved people trying to cross the border and going into Guatemala. I mean, if we look at the 18th century, for instance, this had always been the case, that there was always movement across these borders. What happened now, though, in 1825 is that there was a kind of de facto legality to this flight. And there was a reason for this. The British themselves were pretty much on the same page as Central America in terms of the fact that emancipation had, would happen, and at least that they shared the same ideals of abolition. And so the British did not want to take the side of slave owners when Guatemala gave refuge to these enslaved people. And so it's interesting that in the 1820s, you have this moment when the free and unfree parts of Central America are kind of, going concurrently, and that makes those gaps possible within which enslaved people were able to get their freedom, right? And this is, again, I think is interesting because in the first case of the Mosquito Shore case, we saw how it was pretty much a top-down thing of the imperial government creating a situation where, the settlers were coming under some sort of a challenge. This case, though, is from a below, right? It's about enslaved people themselves leaving the system and therefore challenging it in very large numbers. And now together, both of these cases were really important in kind of fracturing not just settler sovereignty over slavery, but also this image that had been built of somehow slavery in Belize being better than in other parts of the Caribbean. Now, in 1811, George Henderson had actually written this piece where he had talked about, the joy and merriment in mahogany camps, about how Afro-descended and Africans enslaved people had similar dwellings to the white settlers. And really this image had been projected of sort of this very kind of rosy image of slavery in Belize. Now, when the Mosquito Shore case happens and is followed by the this kind of flight of enslaved people, it really fractures that image. And but it's interesting that the settlers don't kind of, you know, they don't go gently into the night, right? They fight against this. They try to recoup that image, and they do it through a lot of different means at their disposal, the primary one of which is the print media. And so one is that they write this defense against defense of the settlers against George Arthur. And then also from 1826 onwards, they have this a newspaper called the Honduras Gazette and Commercial Advertiser, which becomes a mouthpiece of the white settler elite. And in the pages of these documents, they try to show how slavery in Belize was actually benign. They talk about how they had already taken steps to improve the condition of enslaved people even before any kind of metropolitan, you know, intervention. They also compare slavery in Belize to slavery in other parts of the Americas, and look at and kind of say that slavery was much more benign in Belize. And through these, in fact, they also say that enslaved people in Belize were better off than working class people in Britain. So through all these means, they try to create a narrative of benign slavery. Now, the interesting part, of course, is how much this contributed to the origin myth of Belize. So one of the things that the settlers said in those documents is they talked about the battle at St. George's Key, and talked about how the enslaved and the white settlers have actually been united in their sort of, you know, in this shared way of kind of getting rid of Spanish, and sort of this kind of unity of enslaved and masters was something that was part of that that discourse. And this, of course, translated into the origin myth of Belize, which we can see in this stamp right here, right? It's kind of shoulder to shoulder. And that, of course, narrative persisted. And in fact, the benign slavery narrative, to some extent, still persists today. So that was the way that they responded to the fracturing. So, okay, now I'm going to conclude. So just want to give a quick recap of things. So in the 1820s, you have this very singular moment when you have amelioration, creating the conditions whereby the imperial government tried to get more control over its colonies and also its frontier and borderland regions in the Caribbean. And so they were able to bring Belize within the legal purview through its commissions of legal inquiry and through the actions of Superintendent George Arthur, and kind of fractured the settler sovereignty over slavery in that way. Following that, the case of the runaway enslaved people also fractured slavery from below. Both of these kind of militated against this notion of this kind of slavery as being wholesome in Belize. The settlers try to recoup their image by creating a narrative of benign slavery and through their print media. And this narrative became quite robust in the sense that it, I think in many ways, it still colors academic and popular notions of slavery in Belize. So that's it. Thank you very much for patiently listening to me. I look forward to discussing this more with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raj. I think we are hearing some virtual applause. That was an excellent intervention, and we appreciate it very much. I found your article to be very insightful. I appreciate that you were able to, as I said in the beginning, maneuver with at least like global context of what's happening in the world in terms of empire making and what's happening on the ground in this borderland. And I think you didn't elaborate on that concept too much, so I would want to kind of pick off our discussion there. Maybe what you and sort of literature are interested when you refer to this concept of borderlands, and in particular, you know, how in my view too, like Belize has always been sort of like this borderland, and you're looking at the 1820s, but if you look even at the point of Belize becoming a colony in 1862, it's still a borderland at that point, and that's mainly because too you're dealing with the caste war and the movement of Maya and mestizos and Yucatans in the north, and even up to to Belize City. I mean, that's your other article, which is fantastic. But essentially, then even into the early 1900s, when you see the attacks by Marcus Kendall and the local settlers elites always trying to get intervention from the UK, and that consolidates more power. But I mean, then you have the issues around Belize and Guatemala and the boundaries, and so that persists into the 1960s, and upon independence, and even now, you know, well, it will be resolved at the ICJ. But just to emphasize how maybe this concept of borderland can also sort of like help us to understand Belizean history more broadly. Maybe just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important kind of concept. And I think just like any concept is something that, of course, you know, it can be questioned in many ways, but I find it useful because for me, a borderland, so there are two ways of thinking about a borderland, right? We talk about words like core, periphery, when we mean core areas of the empire where the empire really had a huge amount of jurisdiction, and peripheral areas. Borderland is a little bit different because borderland implies that that area is straddling two distinct empires or two distinct political zones. So it is a borderland is also where, you know, two cultures will meet, or two kinds of, you know, ethnicities might meet. So borderland also has that implication that it is never, a borderland is never, you know, a space that is only for, you know, it kind of defies this idea that there is only a single kind of political or ethnic other entity in that region. It always implies that there is a kind of negotiation happening with another entity. And so in that sense, borderlands are really kind of contested regions because it has kind of claims from different sides on it. For the British Empire, I think the idea of borderlands also means that it is in a way, it is, you know, where the British Empire kind of meets another power, whether it is in the colonial period or in the 18th century, it is the Spanish, or later. So I mean, so you always have to have kind of this, you know, that's why borderlands are fraught regions. And for later in the 19th century, when you have the caste war, then it's, you know, that war is mainly, so what I've looked at is mainly the northern borderland region. Christine Cray is working on the western borders, and I think her book is coming out or has come out already. So those borderlands, again, very interesting in terms of being zones where you have also Maya people interacting with, you know, Creoles and other kinds of ethnicities on those borders. So I think borderland in that sense for me is always a contested place. And I think, and the other thing, of course, is that, you know, all the borderlands are contested. Borders themselves are always fluid, right? In the sense that, you know, there's always been movement across these borders. There's always been movement between Mexico and Belize, between Guatemala and Belize. And so I think there is a sense that, you know, there are borderlands, but there are also borders which in some ways bring people together.
Right. No, thank you, Dr. Raj. That's very important for us to underscore. And I think sort of like leading on from that theoretical approach is this concept of anti-hegemony, or hegemony and anti-hegemony, or coloniality and anti-coloniality. I think that's very evident in your research, and in particular, I think it also helps us to have a broad understanding of even today's society. Like, how do we try to comprehend how elites function and how the subaltern function, and how maneuvers of control and liberation are taking place in this very contradictory space-time. And so, for instance, you mentioned three core areas that you looked at: diplomacy, the media, and sort of looking at ideology. And I think those still function today, doesn't it? Like when you think about global politics today, how elites in the world use diplomacy, use politics, use media to maintain a particular status quo that is convenient and for them. And I think that sort of historical analysis allows us to have a better understanding of today's society, and especially when it comes to ideology. I think as I've mentioned, we are sort of like wrapping up September, a month of celebrations, and September 10th, stems from that moment of coloniality, right? In 1898, and reflecting on the Battle of St. George's Key at that point. But then these moments sort of like always have different inflections, and you have different interpretations that go on over time. But it challenges many of our assumptions. So, for instance, you mentioned how important that narrative became in painting enslavement in Belize as a rosy picture, and yet you'll have this contrary narrative saying, oh, that was actually the foundation of Belize. But you opened up your presentation with that excellent selection there, that Belize was a settlement for certain purposes in the possession and under protection of His Majesty, but not within the territory and dominion of His Majesty. And this is post the battle, right? And like they clearly admitted, like, yeah, eventually the Battle of St. George's Key becomes part of a narrative of conquest. But at that time, in that historical space-time, it was not. There was great uncertainty at the imperial level. At the local level, you've indicated that was indeed a reason why we saw more institutional building and greater consolidation of colonial settler power, or their sovereignty. And I appreciate that concept that you've been teasing out in this research. And so I like that. But just to say, maybe your reflections and sort of like how your philosophical approach to history in terms of hegemony and anti-hegemony plays a role in your interest and motivation as a scholar of history.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. I think this idea of hegemony is kind of ruled by consent, right? It assumes that, people will buy into that narrative, that they kind of already buy into that narrative. And I also feel that, for instance, and you brought up St. George's Key, and I feel the reason why I find that myth to be problematic is because of its kind of exclusionary nature, right? I think the fact that there is a long history in Belize of Maya people, of people who are cross borders from neighboring places, and actually the idea that even though it kind of in some ways talks about a sort of a Creole society, but because that battle was very much against kind of vilifying the Spanish element, right? I think in some ways it kind of excludes from the national imagination a very plural society, which is what Belize is. It's a very plural society, and I feel that's why this myth is something that probably needs to be problematized. And I think it's also interesting how a lot of historians have actually begun to look at the different myths of Belize and trying to challenge them. So, for instance, the myth that of the Bayman, right? So the fact that there was a Wallace on whose name Belize was, and people like I think Matthew Restall, Barbara and Victor Bulmer Thomas, Mavin Campbell, all of them have actually looked at this origin myth and said that actually didn't happen. In fact, Restall has this idea that in fact Belize comes from the Maya word Bel Itza, which means a path to Itza. And in fact that the origin of the name Belize is not from Wallace. So I think now to what extent we believe these counter narratives, I don't know, but I think the idea itself that there can be counter narratives, that in fact as our job as a historian is not simply to it's to question in many ways, right? Like the received wisdom is, especially when the received wisdom was created in a colonial structure. And it's really important then to kind of question what were the motivations. For instance, one of the reasons that Restall gives of why Wallace was kind of seen as this, founder, is because it allowed for the Baymen to make a claim onto this land, and to convince the British imperial government that they had a claim on this land, right? So I think all of these myths, I think, are interesting because once you start digging into them, you figure out that they were created at certain points in time because of certain agendas.
Right.
And I think our role as historians is to, and through historical methods, right? Not through opinions, not through any kind of prejudice, but through what data we have in front of us, what we can read through our documents, to piece together a history that that kind of challenges things that we kind of have as received.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Raj. And I think one of the other points that I wanted to just kind of like cement into this discussion is to say the role of suffering that happened during enslavement in Belize. You were able to, for instance, highlight how Superintendent Arthur's reports that were being sent back to the colonial office helped in some ways the anti-abolitionist movement. And so I think that's an important point that I would want to sort of like underscore here. And in fact, I thank you because it was one of your footnotes. And thank you so much for putting so much good information into footnotes, I must say. It's like you have the body of the research, but when you get to the footnotes, there's so much more there. So I appreciate that your time that you took to that. And in one of those footnotes, you reference the substance of the debate on the motion for the abolition of slavery of 1823. And I was able to access that on Google Books. And in that, I also learned about the case of Kwashiba and, how her torture was used to say, listen, you can't be saying slavery in Belize is benign and it's the most wonderful thing in the world when you clearly have here the same Superintendent Arthur reflecting on what the brutality was being punished on Kwashiba, and also the fact that the perpetrator received like a very minimal sentence, and that's not acceptable. This is not where Belize is, and we must improve the situation there. And I think that type of research is so crucial for us in Belize because we need to better understand the dynamics of what is local and what is global, and how Belize contributes to the global, as well as we being imposed upon that the actions of the enslaved, and if you look at different historical periods, the actions of the subaltern helps to advance certain progress, both locally but also maybe regionally and globally. And so that's just more of a comment that leads into a question around methodology. How are you able to do this research? Were you able to visit the UK, or do you access records from them digitally? What was it like doing this paper?
So doing research for this project was really strange because I was writing during the pandemic and doing most of this research during the pandemic when everything was closed. Good thing was that I actually had collected some of these documents prior to the pandemic starting. And so because I couldn't go to any more archives, I started looking at what documents do I already have. And in fact, at that time, I was doing some research on mosquito shore, and I had some of these documents. And it's really interesting for me how, Belize is everywhere. When you start looking at, kind of 19th century mosquito shore history, it is really, Belizeans trying to get mahogany in mosquito shore. In fact, the first couple of people who tried to resume British relations with mosquito shore are British superintendents in mosquito shore, like Alexander MacDonald. And in fact, so I had some of this before. And one of the things I kind of emphasize, I think, for students out there, I think, is that it's really important that we take very good records in the archives. Some archives allow you to digitize, and I think that's a really huge help that has happened in recent years, where we can actually digitize a lot of our documents and bring it. The only issue, I think, with writing history of enslavement is that the archives themselves are curated, right? Archives themselves have been made by a state with an agenda. And so the kinds of things you will find in an archive are already pre-decided by whatever state, right? So I think people like Ann Stoller have talked about this kind of, knowledge violence, like epistemic violence, where you have a colonial state kind of deciding what are going to be the documents in your archive. And so I think then what happens is that as a historian who's working on enslaved people, because it's so hard to get their voices, right? The only way you get at their voices is through kind of the reports like Arthur sent out. It's really hard to get at, what their motivation was. And oftentimes what you have to do is you have to put different documents together and look at them kind of together and compare things to kind of understand what was going on. So I think that's also something to kind of think about, is how do we read these documents? There is a method that a lot of historians talk about. It's called reading against the grain. And reading against the grain is basically, say you have a document that was curated by a colonial power or some kind of national power, and then you are trying to unearth the voices of the people who were subjugated. How do you do it? You take a document and you just like question it so much, but you ask every sentence you pick out and try to read it in a way that allows you to see agency, right? I think Karen McPherson has done a really interesting thing, which is she's looked at, female agency of enslaved women. And one of the things she, I think, says is that, in fact, the reason why you see so many cases of enslaved women in these cases, is that enslaved women were able to understand that there was a friction between the settlers and the superintendent, and that they were able to use their agency to kind of bring these cases to the superintendent. So I think that is if that is true, that means that women had a really critical role in bringing these cases to the authorities, right? And can you imagine the kind of risks they took at that time to do this? Right. So I think this also allows us to see kind of, because so much of the history of enslavement takes away the agency of the enslaved. And I think through these ways, we can try to understand, how would they have been motivated? How could they have, kind of wrested out of all this misery, some kind of dignity, and still being able to kind of, push forward, right? So I think that's I think, part of it.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Raj, for that comment, especially around methodology. And I even noted in your own text that you use multiple sources, including some Spanish archives to emphasize some of the points. And so that's important for students and other researchers to take note. Like more and more, we're seeing more digital access to archives from different parts of the world. And that's a good thing, and Belize will continue also to do its part. But let me end our discussion there, Dr. Raj, and say thank you so much. And I'll divert back to April Martinez, who is a Living Heritage Officer at ISCR, but who is also functioning as a moderator for today's session. Let me see if she can maybe point us to other questions that have come up or help in moderating persons who would want to ask a question. April?
Hi, yes, good morning. I had just queued in the group chat. If anybody has any questions or you would like to make a comment, they could open their mics, of course, or they could put their question in the chat that is here. I understand that we have many students that are taking history right now that are online with us. So if they have a question or a comment, or even something that perhaps they would need a little bit more clarification on, that would be great. I see Dr. DeShiel has his hand raised. Doc, you could put on your mic, please. And of course, if we could see you put your camera on so that our live audience can engage. All right, thank you so much. Take it away, Doc.
Thank you. I hope the mic and camera are working. I just wanted to say thank you for this amazing presentation and for this opportunity that NICH has created here. I'm very happy to join and was able to hear the presentation. There's several questions that came up in the presentation I wanted to put forward, or comments. And one came out of the last exchange between Director Kokum and yourself, Dr. Dutt, on the motives, you were talking about maybe the motives of George Arthur here. And I noted in the first act that you described, you spoke about George Arthur's acts as being unprecedented in that he bypassed these mechanisms of law, you said, and the magistrates using these racial categories and appealing to like international law, it seemed. But it almost sounded as if this was prompted, maybe in part, by a kind of moral outrage or compassion that was provoked by the stories that he hears from especially the abuse of the female slaves. And that ties into this abolitionist movement. And I wondered if there is any other evidence for this beyond the commissions of inquiry that were sent out by him. Or would you say that, you know, these narratives, these stories or snapshots of abuse primarily feed in as an opportunity to undermine the sovereignty of the so-called Baymen of the region? Is that, you know, is that primarily a challenge then to the magistrates and these slave owners' power for him? Because it seems like there's a similar type of motive then, I guess I'm saying, between George Arthur and these Baymen, in that both of them seem to be presenting their sides as this benign force, while the Baymen are trying to claim that, you know, slavery is so benign and actually the slaves are treated better in British Honduras than freed people are treated in current day England. George Arthur, doesn't he also have an agenda in trying to present this in British imperial force as primarily a benign global force? And then the Baymen are just basically playing this small time game as compared to George Arthur's global imperial game, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's really, really interesting.
Thanks.
I think there's actually a really great book. It's by, I think, Alan Lester, and he's written a book on George Arthur. It's called Humanitarian Governance, I think. Anyway, it's a really interesting.
So I think your mic is muted. I just lost the.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
You mentioned a book on George Arthur.
There's a book by. Let me just try to put it here on the chat because, let's see how I can put it in the chat. Yeah, this book, I think I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think there's a book by Alan Lester called Humanitarian Governance, and it's about George Arthur. So I think that that's a really good book for someone who wants to go deeper into Arthur himself. For what it's worth, the settlers themselves had a lot of criticism of George Arthur. And in fact, they said that George Arthur was actually doing this to deflect from his bad reputation in Belize, that he was actually not a very popular person. And so he was trying to deflect from it by putting the blame on the settlers. So that was the settlers themselves kind of having that. But my personal feeling is that, you know, at this point, you kind of see this kind of, you know, liberal ideology, right, coming into being. And I think George Arthur was kind of liberal in the way that he did espouse these values of humanitarianism. This was a kind of a period in which liberalism kind of emerges. And I think what we see of George Arthur, both in Belize and in the other postings he had, is that he does try to, you know, for instance, this protection of what he calls protections of Aborigines. He does this in other postings as well, not just in Belize, but other places as well. He tries to do the same thing. So I think that it would probably be, for me, I think he had some genuine, you know, whether it was kind of because he was part of the imperial machinery and he wanted to do the work of the empire, and therefore his agenda was to, you know, to kind of do what the empire wanted him to do, or whether it was because of some kind of humanitarianism that was really within him, is hard to say. But I personally think that he was a man of that age of kind of when there's a shift towards kind of liberal ideology, and he is trying to bring that in. And I think the reason I think so is because does similar things in other postings as well, that he goes to. But I think it would be good to like kind of dig more deep into him. I personally wasn't able to dig very much into George Arthur himself, but I think that's a huge like way to go into that history, and kind of, you know, and I think for a future research avenue, I think it's just a huge place that can be done, because I think Alan Lester's book does a bit of Belize, but he also focuses on other places, so he doesn't go that much in depth into Belize. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. I don't know, it's just a good question. I don't have a pat answer to it.
That's a great answer, Dr. Raj.
Yes, I believe Mr. Pinello had a question in the chat, and he was asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on if you can, on Arthur's morals or religious perspectives or points of view.
Again, I don't know to what extent his religious views came into play in what he did. I think he was motivated mostly from his position as a superintendent, and the fact that, for instance, he not only tries to bring legal purview into the question of slavery, but also in the question of land. So he understands that the settler power comes from their domination of land.
Right.
And so, in fact, one of the things he tries to do is to try to curtail that kind of power. So again, I'm not sure whether it is really a moral reason why he goes, and I think there's a larger kind of agenda that Arthur has of really, you know, fracturing the settler elite power. And I think part of this could be, as I think Dr. D. Shield mentioned, is that part of it, I think, it is that he is really seeing the settler elite as the primary you know, not opponent, but really the primary rival in terms of power in the settlement, right? Because the magistrates have executive power. And so for the superintendent to, and I think as we go in the 19th century, right, we see the progressive curtailment of magisterial power, of the public meeting dissolving after of some time. And so I think that there is a progressive, like you see the power of the public meeting and magistrates really reducing to the extent that allows for Belize to become a colony, right? And have more and more imperial purview. So I personally think it's probably because of Arthur's desire to really curtail the power of the settler elite, who was his main rival in that sense, right? As a location of executive power in Belize. So I don't know whether to what extent it was moral. My personal opinion is more political, I think.
Yes, sometimes it's very difficult in our history to gauge a person's morals or ethical perspectives, because that's not something that they're going to write in their books, right? We have Tara Chadwick, that she has her hand raised. Tara, can you put on your mic and your camera, please? Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for hosting this amazing second History Lab. It is so beautiful to be able to participate in this way. I'm a Belizean Canadian living in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I just wanted to ask you one question about your map. If you could please send us the reference to the map that has the Mosquito Shore on it. And I also wanted to make a quick comment, because as historians and academics in general, oftentimes we're trained to become objective observers. And I just wanted you to know that today, by listening to this, you have contributed to my knowledge of my own family, of my own grandmother, that, you know, I had to sit, like many of us, listening to the, you know, the oral history of who all the grandmothers were for 7 generations back. And so that map, you know, is one that I haven't seen in that detail before. And so I just wanted you to know, and also for the students who are listening, that there is that part of history that is part of who we are. And so thank you for your work. I don't know, today's my first time meeting you, but I'm so surprised and so amazed and so appreciative of the work that you're doing. And I want you to know that I'm going to bring this back to my family. I'm going to read the article. And I just encourage everybody to, keep on using this technology so that we can be fully who we are by learning our past and reflecting on that past so that we can chart a better course to the future, because knowing ourselves is also being fully who we are, and that's going to make us healthier human beings. So thank you for doing this work and bringing part of myself back to me through it.
Thank you so much. That's the nicest thing I've ever heard anyone say. It's actually just made my day.
You made me cry. You made me cry.
You just made my day. I mean, it's evening for us now, 9:30, but I just feel so full inside. Just so happy to hear that, and actually feel that as students, and I think we're all talking to students here, it's so important to have Belizean voices out there, Belizeans doing Belizean history. I'm from India, and I think that, as much as all of us who work on Belize and are fascinated and love Belize, we are still working from the outside. And I feel that this generation of Belizean students who can kind of take their history by the horns and kind of write their own histories is what is really going to matter in the end. So I just really hope that there are lots more Belizean voices. I mean, I have been in talks with Rolando for a while, and some of his insights are just amazing. And Dr. Shoman, I think, is coming up with his really revised 13 chapters of Belize. So those are just like amazing things that are happening around the corner. And I just hope that the youngsters kind of pick up this interest in history and kind of, also rewrite it, right, as they go forward. But thank you so much for your comments. They're so full today of, I'm so happy, and you just made my day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Doc. We have a student, a history student, Dylan Coleman, who asked a question in the chat. He says here, further to Dr. DeShields' mention on these colonial agendas, would you say that the barristers sent by the Metropolitan Court in England, having recommended the emancipation of the indigenous Mosquito Coast slaves, were impelled do so because of an anti-colonial or anti-imperial global sentiment? In other words, was it expedient to the greater British Empire to emancipate these slaves in an effort to slow their destruction of their dominion and not do any moral reflection?
Thank you. So that's a really great question. I mean, the motivations for why should the empire kind of bring emancipation? And I think one of the important things to think about is that at the point, the changes in the world economy, right? And in terms of kind of going towards wage labor as a way of really maximizing the profits of the empire, but also there is a broader kind of humanitarian abolitionism that was growing in Britain at that time. So I think there was a sense that there would have been, and I think there was some of it is actually from below as well, right? I think it's the Jamaica Revolt of 1832. I think that really, triggers the emancipation, right? It's the fact that enslaved people revolted in such large numbers in Jamaica that actually created a situation where, that was the only answer at that point, right? So I think that in terms of motivation of the imperial power, part of it was economic, part of it was really going along with the times and with the fact that abolitionism had reached that level. But I also think that in some ways it was a tide that could not be resisted. And I think a lot of it had to do with what was happening in below. I think in Rolando, I think in his emancipation address talked about the 1820 Will and Sharp revolt. But there were also revolts, in terms of looking at resistance of enslaved people. I think that had a huge role to play in what ultimately happened. So yeah, I think to some extent it was kind of this humanitarianism that was building out of the abolitionist movement, but I think, and also the economic kind of reasons, but also I think it was what was happening at the ground level that was prompting these changes.
Agreed. Thank you. I hope I answered your question, Jaden. I believe Mr. Zib, Delmer Zib, has his hand up for a question, Doc. Delmer, can you put your mic and your camera on so that our live audience can see and hear you? Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Delmer Zib from the University of Belize. Thank you for such an insightful presentation. I really enjoyed the discussion that we're having this morning. I wanted to sort of connect your presentation and sort of play the devil's advocate with some of my questions in that how do we define who are the Baymen? I mean, there are some narratives today that say that the Baymen encompasses not only the white settlers, but a wider cross-section of the Belizean society, to state that it was everybody in the settlement. So that's my first question. The second question is, you are referring to some of the myths around Belizean sort of formation, national formation, if you want to call it that way, and the myths that the colonial entities created to build or bring forward this British Honduras and later on Belize. When we question, or how do we question these narratives and myths, does that put in danger ideas of modern day nationalism per se, right? Because, for example, just yesterday, we visited the National Assembly and we noted that the mace has some expressions of the Battle of St. George's Key on it as well. And well, that's just one example of the many other in Belizean society today. And these myths served a purpose in their point, but it seems like it's been adopted and there's a level of continuity to it. And I think that discussions on how to address these issues are very important, especially as we are developing historians for the future, right? There is a level of uncertainty of how should we address these issues in an academic format as well as in a public forum. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. These are just amazing, amazing questions. So I'll take the first question first about the Baymen. I think it's just interesting how, you know, this idea of the Baymen, I think itself is kind of a myth, right? Because of course, Belize as a society only became a society because of enslaved people, because white settlers had enslaved people to work for them. And in fact, if you look at the peopling of Belize, the majority of people were enslaved people. And yet when we talk about Baymen, it is always this white settler elite. And the reason why that is because the white settler elite themselves made this narrative, right? They themselves said that in the 18th century or in the 17th century, the Baymen were these buccaneers or others who had settled, and they were the first people who created a settlement. And this idea that they were somehow the first claimants to this land, right? That this land was theirs to claim, and because they were the first. I think is actually itself a narrative, right? Because it immediately suggests that this place was depopulated, that there was nobody there, that there were no previous Maya or other people living here, and that it was only the white settlers who had a prior claim to this area, and therefore should control the lands and resources of this region, right? So I think you're perfectly correct in saying that who are the Baymen really, and who really were there. And I think this is something that Matthew Restall has an article. I'm going to just put it here because I think it might be interesting for you. Restall has this article in this journal called Terra Incog. It's hard to write this. And this article actually is really interesting because he goes into that Baymen myth, and he actually traveled through lots and lots of different archives. He looked at a lot of records, and he makes some very interesting claims there about the Baymen, which I think, again, is a really good topic for future work. But again, this is a good article. I don't personally go into Baymen themselves, but Restall has done that. So that's why I put that over there. In terms of the second question, I think when so much of these myths have a place in society and in our questions of national formation and identity, what is the risk we run when we try to demythify them? I think that's a question for people to ask, right? Is that, are the myths serving society? Are the myths really allowing for a plural society where there is no prejudice, or whether the myths are actually, hindering that process of kind of, uniting people despite their diversity, right? So I think that's something to kind of think about. And I think that every generation has to kind of reevaluate something that for a previous generation would have been maybe a way for bringing the people together and, going for independence, or that those reasons may be quite different now, when now the forces at work are global forces. There is a different kind of setup of dominance and exploitation, right? Which is a lot about through sort of questions of whether it is a neoliberalism or whatever else. But I think the question to ask is that for this generation, are these myths serving a purpose? And even if they are serving the purpose, isn't it important to know why those myths came to be in the first place? I mean, even if we never discard any of the myths, I think it's really important to be aware of where our myths come from, because that tells us a lot about not only how society evolved, but also the challenges people faced in trying to live in that kind of society, right? So I think that's something to for every kind of citizen to kind of think about.
Definitely agreed. I really appreciate that question as well, since we just had our September celebrations month. It was definitely in tune, tied more to Tent, our Battle of St. George's Day, and our Independence Day on the 21st. So thank you so much for that insight, Doc. We have room and time, I believe, for one more question, whether it be in the chat or in put on your mics, raise your hands, please. I see Dr. Deshil, I think you look like you have one more question that you'd like to ask. You could take the opportunity now if you wish. Yes, go ahead.
All right, quickly, while someone else is formulating their question, maybe we'll sneak in too, but following up, comment on my colleague Delmar's question about the Baymen. I was having discussion with him just while you were doing the presentation. We were thinking about this idea of the Baymen indeed, and I wonder how unique Belize is, because the situation you described, it almost sounds like the way that you use the word Baymen, it almost seems like a synonym for the Creole, in that old sense of this white settler that's coming to this area. And if you compare to some of the other territories, well, at least in Latin America, they have this whole these Creole nationals, basically, that are leading the independence movement much earlier than the British Empire would have. But in Belize, it seems as if these Creole nationalists have the sovereignty, which they then gradually cede or erodes, and it's then given back to empire. It's almost a reverse, I don't know if that's the right word, of what goes on in the other territories. And I wonder if there are any other places that experience this kind of transition, where they have sovereignty, cannot sustain it, can't maintain it, or some degree of sovereignty, and then have to kind of give it up. And then we have the independence move much, much later.
I think in some ways, thank you for the question. I think partly, I think this, when you're talking about, say, 18th century, I think it's very much white settler elite we're talking about. So I think that is definitely the case, right? Whereas, of course, the myth itself is a kind of a myth of Creole-ness, right? But I think it's really the people in power are, in terms of, later, of course, you have a lot of Creoles as well who assume those positions. But in the very beginning, I think we can talk about sort of a white settler elite, I think. In that sense, it's not so different from other parts of Latin America, because in all other parts of Latin America as well, you've always had this kind of, racial domination by the Blancos, right? Or the what they used to call the pure of blood, whether it's the Spaniards who come into parts of Yucatan, which is like congruent to Belize, when and of course, the interesting thing, of course, is that there's always going to be, that racial domination only works by the creation of hierarchies. And I think that in some ways, I think it is not that there was in the beginning a kind of a sovereignty of a mixed race sovereignty. I think that is something that probably was not there in any of these areas, right? I think in the beginning, it's probably a very kind of blanco, kind of a white sovereignty. And then later, of course, as life progresses, you do have mixing. That's why mestizaje, or in a lot of Latin American countries are even have their national identity as mestizos, right? Mixed races. And I think that is something that is there. And I think in that sense, maybe there can be more comparisons done with other Latin American nations or Central America, and see how race has operated, right, from the colonial to the post-colonial times, and how that has happened. Because even places like Yucatan, I mean, we know that there were Afro-descended people as well there, right, who were enslaved. So I think sometimes it's actually, your question is really great, because it kind of helps us pan out a bit and see that entire zone as a zone in which there were all these different ethnicities, right, coexisting. And how did they coexist? Did they coexist by creating hierarchies and making one at the top, or did they coexist by creating some kind of organic mixture, right? Like, so I think those are really interesting questions, and allows us to kind of insert Belize within a broader discussion of race in Central America, race in Latin America. And I thought that's a really brilliant question. I think there's lots of ways to go with that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dutt. I believe that does it for our Q&A session. We want to thank you so much, Dr. Rajeshwari, for your wonderful presentation and just the amount of research that you've done in Belize. We hope that you come back. Even if it's just for a visit, we hope that you come back. I would like to thank our viewers, both on YouTube and those that have joined us via Zoom here. Thank you to all the students, our colleagues from the University of Belize, and other colleagues from the National Institute of Culture and History. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Before you all run away, I would like to announce that we will be continuing this research lab series. And our third lab series will be on the Maya and the Belizean state in 1997 to 2004. And that presentation will be conducted by Professor Joel Wainwright and Dr. Filiberto Penados. And they will be in to discuss as well. We're going to have this series right here via Zoom, and that will be scheduled for October 24th at 5 p.m. And of course, we are going to naturally notify you all throughout our social media pages, and probably send you the article as well, so that you have more insight and more content for discussion. But thank you so much, Dr. Dutt, for joining us. I know it's very late, but thank you so much nonetheless for joining us this morning. I will have Rolando give some concluding remarks before we log off. Thank you once again.
Just thank you, April, for being our host, and to all our attendees, both on the Zoom and those who will be watching the recording on YouTube in posterity. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajeshwari. I'm sure students and others who are interested can reach out to you. Your email is available online, so if they do research, they can contact you for follow-up questions and encouragement along the way. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajeshwari. We appreciate your support, and we appreciate the work that you have done on Belize, and we hope that you can continue to do so. And perhaps on another in another space, we will have you speak on the other wonderful work that you have done on Belize and gain some more insights and encouragement. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rolando and April and everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, viewers. We'll see you then on October 24th. Take care.